Good afternoon, MechGag 114. In this video lab, I'm going to go over how to install the engine components on our Honda engine. On these engines, we're going to start with our valves, and you can see I have my two valves for this engine right here in the camera. The first valve we're going to install is our intake valve. You'll notice on valve setup that your intake valve is much larger or slightly larger. Could be one or the other. Comparison to the exhaust valve, and so we want to make sure that those get put into the correct place, because if you mix them up, you're going to lose all of your compression in the cylinder. Now, on your intake valve on this engine is going to have a valve seal that sits on top of the valve, on the other side of what would be called a cylinder head. We don't have a cylinder head on there, but it's going to go on right here on where the valve comes through. And then we're going to add the spring, and then we're going to add the retainer on there as well. And so you're going to have your valve spring and retainer, and then you're going to switch over to the other valve, and we're going to install our exhaust valve in. So if you look here, all we do is push down, retainer holds the spring in place and holds the valve in place. Since these engines don't have a cylinder head on them per se, or a removable cylinder head, it can be kind of hard to install the valves. And so you'll actually see me switch gears a little bit and add some pliers to hold the valve in place to get it in. See, my hands are a little big to try and fit in there. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to grab a pair of pliers, and then I'm going to hold the valve, and I'm going to line it up to go into the valve guide. And that's basically just going to help me. It's essentially like extending my fingers by a couple of inches. So it helps it out a little bit as far as that goes. As soon as I get my valve in, my exhaust valve in, and you'll know on some exhaust valves they'll have letters on there, and this one has an E on the bottom of it. But once my exhaust valve goes in, I'm going to grab the spring and the retainer, and I'm going to install that as well so that both my valves are then put into place and at the right part, at the right with the manufacturer's recommendations. From here, I am going to install my piston. Now, your piston has to be lined up properly. And so there's a proper way. If you look on the piston themselves, on the connecting rod, there'll be a little mark on there. And that's going to tell me it's going to tell me flywheel side on there. And on this connecting rod, it looked like a little circle. So here in a second, it's going to show up in the video of how we're going to align this up so that my piston goes in correctly. If you don't put that piston in correctly, it will not connect to the components properly, and it can cause engine damage. So if I see that little circle on the connecting rod, that tells me that goes on the flywheel side. Now, typically, I would use a piston ring compressor to install the piston, but on this engine, there's a little tapered end on the end of the cylinder, and so we don't need that tool. But we are going to have to use some lubricant. You always lubricate the parts as you put them back together, especially the internal components. So I added some grease to my cylinder wall. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my piston, make sure I'm in the proper alignment. And then I'm going to install my piston. So as you see, as I start to work this through, you'll see my fingers kind of push around on the piston rings. And that kind of helps squeeze those piston rings down a little bit past the taper that I just pointed at. One thing about pistons is you don't want to hit them too hard when they're being installed, because there can be some significant damage to the rings, and the rings could actually break. So as I start to push in my piston, one thing you'll notice on my left hand, you can't really see, but my left hand is down on the other side, pushing down on a valve, and that's just to remove any compression that is within the cylinder at that time. If we don't, that piston won't go in. You'll push and push and push, and it'll never go into the cylinder. So as I work my piston in, and you can see I'm using fingers, and I finally get my piston into the cylinder, I'm going to push it all the way up to top dead center as best as I can, as far as I can. And that way it'll open up to where I am able to install my crankshaft onto this engine. Most engines we would actually install the crankshaft first, but on this engine it's actually the fourth component. So we do our 2 valves, then our piston, and now I'm going to install my crankshaft. And so what you'll see me do here is I'm going to add grease to the connecting or to the crankshaft, and that's to pre-lubricate those bearing surfaces. And if you don't pre-lubricate it, when the engine goes to start, there's a chance that friction will build up between the components, and then you'll have damage to the internal stuff. So I'm actually adding grease to 2 journals, my magneto journal, which is where my flywheel connects to, and then the crank pin journal is where my connecting rod from my piston will actually connect to. So I'm going to push my connecting rod all the way to the side, and then I'm going to insert my crankshaft into the bearing. And then I'm going to attach my piston from there. And you'll see it slides in really easy. It's almost like a puzzle, but it goes in just nice and easy. I'm going to rotate my crankshaft around. And that'll open up a little area to where I can get my fingers in there to be able to pull the piston downward. So when the piston's sitting all the way up the top of the cylinder, it's real hard to get a wrench or a torque wrench into that component. And so I'm utilizing this to, not utilizing, but I'm working this piston to pull it down from the cylinder a little bit. So I'm going to have to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to have to push on the valve to release compression on that cylinder or on that piston itself. And then 2, you'll actually see me install my rod cap a little bit. And all I'm going to do is just lightly tighten the bolts just to give my crankshaft just the ability to pull it down from the top of the cylinder. You'll notice I'm just hand tightening the bolts right now. I'm not actually going to torque them down. Okay, so here I'm going to push down on my valve, and then I'm going to pull my piston out. You'll see it just by turning my crankshaft. And what that does is it allows me to get access to the end of my connecting rod. So I'm going to remove my rod cap again, and then I'm going to pull my piston, and I'm going to get it to fit as firmly as I can to the crank pin journal. And then I'm going to reinstall my rod cap, and I'm going to torque it down to the recommended torque specifications. So you'll see here, I install my rod cap that only goes on one direction, and then I'm going to insert the screws to tighten that rod cap down. Rod caps and connecting rods can only be hooked up in a certain way, and every manufacturer is a little bit different. They could have numbers on the side. This one, you'll see a little oil dipper sitting there at the top. If I don't put it in correctly, it could cause those 2 surfaces to actually weld together, and it could cause some damage to the components themselves. And so you always want to pay attention when you are reinstalling components that they go in the proper way. So the tool I'm using here is a nut driver. It's just to help me hand tighten these tools down. And then I'm going to use what's called a beam torque wrench. And so a beam torque wrench uses a little flex bar that sits on top of a gauge. And as I go to tighten down that torque wrench, the end of that beam will actually read off of the gauge on my tool and tell me what my torque is. Now the torque specification for this Honda engine is 9 foot-pounds. I do not have a foot-pound torque wrench that can meet that torque specifications. I do have an inch-pound torque wrench. So how do I convert foot-pounds to inch-pounds? So there are 12 inches in a foot. So if I multiply my foot-pound recommendation by 12, that'll actually give me my inch-pound specification. So at 9 foot-pounds is 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going to be doing a two-step torque. And what a two-step torque is means I tighten the bolts gradually. And so I'm going to torque this at 54 foot-pounds each bolt. And then I'm going to torque it again to 108 inch-pounds on each bolt. And that allows the components to go in nice and evenly as far as being tightened down properly. And so it's important that we do that so that we protect those components so that they don't damage themselves. If you over torque these things, it could cause these components to lock up to where they won't want to spin anymore. So I'm walking around away from the table real quick to grab an extension to put on my torque wrench. So you'll see me torque each screw 2 times. The first time for 54 foot-pounds and the second time for 108. So there was the first set of torque. And then here's the second set. Okay. Moving on, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check and make sure that my crankshaft will spin freely. Whenever you install pistons, this is something you want to do on every engine. So that's very, very important to do that. So I'm going to hold down a valve and I'm just going to rotate it around. Make it to where it moves nice and easily. If it doesn't, then loosen up that connecting rod. Check to make sure you have everything put on correctly and then try again. Next, I'm going to install my timing gear. My timing gear needs to match up the mark on the crankshaft. That's very important. And then I'm going to add my timing belt and then my camshaft. And so I'm going to time my connecting rod or my piston, my crankshaft. I'm going to time those with my camshaft so that my valves open at the correct time. And so I add my timing belt, and then I'm going to add my camshaft, and then I'm going to put my camshaft stud in there, stud shaft. Make sure that pops in correctly. And then I'm going to move my camshaft so that the timing marks on my camshaft, on my cam gear, line up to the top of the engine. And then I'm going to make sure my piston is at top dead center on this engine. And so you'll know your piston's at top dead center based on a mark that's on your crankshaft. It's got a little arrow kind of where I'm pointing at. And that's going to be at the top. It's got to be moved around. So there, my piston is at top dead center. The timing marks on my camshaft are lined up. As you can see there. And then, so now I'm going to install my timing belt so that those gears are at the same place. And that's how we time our valves on this engine. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my thrust washer. This thrust washer is directional, so you want to make sure that the direction, the edge, the flared edge, is pointing towards the top or away from the belt. And that's important. From my thrust washer, I'm going to add my sump. And the first thing I'm going to do is take a putty knife and clean off all the old gasket material that's on there, and then I'm going to add new gasket material. So I'm going to add some grease to my crankshaft. I installed my thrust washer already. And now I'm going to add some gasket maker onto my engine block. And we just use a silicone RTV. It's a pretty common gasket making material. I typically don't like to use it because it makes a mess. But Honda didn't make any gaskets for this engine. And the only gaskets that actually came with the engine were on the carburetor and the air cleaner. So it's important to know that we're following manufacturer recommendation as far as adding that gasket material to it. And so it's just a very light amount of gasket maker we're going to put around that sump area. I had to get some more gasket maker, so I had to prep that. So I added all the way around, and you'll see when I finish, there'll be a nice little layer all the way around where my sump goes back onto my engine.
They say to get through about 120.
Sorry about that. My son came in and the microphone picked him up, but he's reminding me of what time he's got to go to school today. So I'm adding my gasket maker, and then I'm going to rotate the engine block so that you can see. And it's a nice little layer. You can see the orange is from the last gasket. Tried to clean off as much as that. The black is what I just added. It doesn't take a whole lot to seal that up. And so from here, I'm going to install my sump. And then I'm going to install the 8 bolts that go to the sump. So I'm going to add these bolts, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to torque these down, and I'm going to do the same type of torque setup on these bolts as I did the connecting rod. I'm going to do a step up. The other thing I'm going to do as far as torquing these bolts down is I'm going to do a cross pattern, so I have even pressure as this thing goes to tighten down. And then I'm also going to do a step up torque as well. So it's the same torque spec as the engine block or as the connecting rod cap. It's going to be 9 foot-pounds. We're going to torque them at 108 foot-pounds. And so we'll go at a nice even cross pattern to tighten them all down. And I'm going to torque each bolt at 54. And then I'm going to torque each bolt at 108. The first thing you always want to do is kind of hand tighten bolts down. That just makes sure that they're seating right on the threads. You never really want to put a wrench on them yet. So I'm using a nut driver. That lets me feel the bolt to make sure that it's going into the threads correctly. Okay. And it's kind of the pattern I was talking about as far as a cross pattern when you go to torque it down. After I get that torqued down, I'm going to install the flywheel. And so that flywheel, it goes on. You got to make sure that the flywheel fits on there properly, and then we're going to torque it down. And so the demonstration will be up here shortly. So I guess here, I got my sump on. I will torque them down. I'm going to add my rocker arms in real quick. Once my rocker arms are installed, I'm going to leave the cap off the top. And then I'm going to go ahead and install my flywheel. Why do I do it that way? Is because I want to be able to adjust my valves. And the proper way to adjust the valves, it's much easier to do with the flywheel on. So that's why I'm going to hold off on adjusting my valves. So the top of these engine, there's 2 pins. And then I'm going to install my rocker arms. And then the pins hold them together. They go on nice and easy. And that's what the top end of my engine will look like after I get my rocker arms installed. Very easy, smooth transition into that. And then the next step I'm going to do, like I was saying, is I'm going to install my flywheel. So I'm going to move my engine block to the side. And then I'm going to grab the flywheel. I'm going to make sure that it seats properly on my crankshaft. And then also the flywheel key that's on there keeps it in place. Okay, so it has to fit properly on my flywheel key. I'm going to put my flywheel fan on, and that goes on a certain way. And it matches in there perfectly. And then I'm going to grab my flywheel nut and I'm going to install that. And then the way to tighten this down is going to require me to use that flywheel strap again and a torque wrench. And the torque setting on this is 38 foot-pounds. So we're going to actually torque this with a foot-pound torque wrench. And we're going to torque it to 38 foot-pounds. And so you see here I'm putting it on my flywheel strap. One thing about the flywheel strap is you want to make sure you put it on the right direction, which I did not when I first started. Okay. And so you actually see me stop and flip my flywheel strap around. Oh, actually, I did hold that correctly. And then after I get my flywheel torqued on, and that's my torque 38 foot-pounds, I'm going to install my magneto. And that's going to finish up this video as far as this lab goes, is installing the internal components and then my flywheel. And so on the next video will be the external stuff and finish putting this up. And that'll be for our next lab.